Hello everyone and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we'll journey together into a story from the English countryside, where rolling hills hide dark secrets, and where a woman's disappearance would become one of Britain's most troubling mysteries. This is the story of Kate Prout. The Gloucestershire countryside in England has always been a place of remarkable beauty. Rolling green fields stretch as far as the eye can see, divided by ancient hedgerows and stone walls that have stood for centuries. Church spires pierce the morning mist, and narrow lanes wind between villages with names that sound like poetry. Redmerley, Ledbury, the Forest of Dean. These are places where time seems to move more slowly, where life follows the rhythm of the seasons. It was in this idyllic setting that Kate Wakefield found herself in the late 1990s. Searching for a fresh start, she had spent years as a school teacher, dedicating herself to education, to shaping young minds. But Kate was ready for something different. She yearned for a quieter life, one connected to nature, away from schedules and classrooms. She wanted to walk in the countryside, to feel the soil beneath her feet, to live at a gentler pace. Kate was 50 years old when she met Adrian Prout. He was a businessman, separated from his first wife, father to a teenage daughter. Adrian ran a pipe-laying business and had recently begun organizing pheasant shoots on farmland. He was practical, hands-on, a man who knew how to work the land and make deals. They met through mutual acquaintances in the countryside community, and something sparked between them. They were both at crossroads in their lives. Adrian was rebuilding after his divorce. Kate was seeking her rural dream. Together, they found common ground. They shared a vision of country living, of building something together. The romance was brief but intense. They were adults who knew what they wanted, and they didn't waste time. By the year 2000, they were married, with Kate's savings and Adrian's business earnings. They purchased their dream. It was called Red Hill Farm, a sprawling property on the outskirts of Redmarley, one of the most picturesque areas in Gloucestershire. The farm consisted of 276 acres of fields and woodland. At its heart stood a handsome farmhouse, the kind of place that appears on postcards advertising the English countryside. They paid £1.2 million for it in 2004. Kate threw herself into creating the life she'd always imagined. She would arrange flowers for the local church, bringing fresh blooms from the farm each week. She walked her dogs across the fields every morning, watching the seasons change, observing the wildlife. She took up pottery, working with clay in a small studio she'd created, finding peace in the act of shaping something with her hands. Adrian focused on the business side of their venture. He expanded the pheasant shooting operation, transforming Red Hill Farm into one of the more popular hunting estates in the region. Wealthy clients would come from across the country to participate in organized shoots, spending their weekends stalking birds through the carefully managed woodland. And Kate became the perfect hostess. With her refined manner and welcoming nature, she would greet the guests, organize elaborate dinners, ensure their stays were comfortable. She prepared food, poured wine, made conversation. To anyone looking from the outside, the Prouts had achieved something remarkable. They seemed to embody the dream of prosperous country living. But dreams, as we know, can fracture. And behind the elegant facade of Red Hill Farm, cracks were beginning to show. First signs appeared in 2006. Kate had begun keeping a diary, a private record of her thoughts and daily life. In its pages, she wrote about her growing suspicions that Adrian was having an affair. She noticed the way he looked at their house-sitter, a woman named Diane Bellamy. Diane had been hired to help maintain the property when Kate and Adrian traveled, and Kate felt increasingly uncomfortable about the relationship between her husband and this younger woman. Kate confronted Adrian. He denied everything, but Kate's instincts told her something was wrong. After they returned from a holiday to Italy, Kate spoke directly to Diane about her suspicions. The conversation was tense, uncomfortable. The atmosphere at Red Hill Farm shifted from comfortable to cold. By 2007, Kate's diary entries had taken on a darker tone. She wrote about arguments, about Adrian's temper, on the 19th of October that year. She wrote words that would later chill everyone who read them. Hadrow said he couldn't wait to get rid of me out of his life. In February of that same year, Kate had called the police. She accused Adrian of assault and threatened to kill her, but without physical evidence, no charges were brought. Kate was left to navigate her deteriorating marriage alone, wondering what would become of her dream. The issue that dominated their arguments was money, specifically the value of Red Hill Farm. With all the improvements they'd made over the years, the property had increased dramatically in value. It was now worth approximately £1.8 million. Kate had contributed significant funds when they'd first purchased it. She felt entitled to her fair share if the marriage was to end. Adrian saw things differently. In his mind, the farm was his creation, his business, his legacy. He operated the chutes, managed the land, handled the day-to-day operations. He offered Kate £600,000 plus maintenance payments. To him, this seemed generous. Kate sought legal advice. Her lawyers told her she was entitled to more, much more. She asked for £800,000 and a clean break. No ongoing ties, no maintenance, just a fair division of assets and the freedom to start over. Adrian was furious. £800,000 would require him to sell the farm, or at the very least, sell off a substantial portion of the land. Everything he'd built would be dismantled. The business would collapse. He felt Kate was being unreasonable, vindictive even. She was trying to destroy what he'd created. On the 4th of November, 2007, Kate withdrew £14,000 from their joint bank account. The money was to fund her legal costs, to ensure she had the resources to fight for what she believed was rightfully hers. She was not backing down. The next day was the 5th of November, Bonfire Night in Britain. A traditional celebration with fireworks and bonfires marking the failed gunpowder plot of 1605. It should have been a night of celebration across the country. For Kate Prout, it would be her last night alive. Kate was last seen during the day on November 5th, buying groceries at a store in Ledbury. Security cameras captured her walking through the aisles, selecting items, going about her ordinary routine. She appeared calm, unhurried. She had no idea what awaited her back at Red Hill Farm. What happened when Kate returned home would remain a mystery for years. The exact details of that evening were known only to one person, but the outcome was unmistakable. At some point during that day or night, in what would later be described as a violent row over money and divorce, Adrian Prout strangled his wife. After killing Kate, Adrian poured himself a glass of whiskey. He sat in their home, the place they'd built together, and drank while Kate's body lay nearby. Then, with methodical calm, he wrapped her body in a curtain. He carried her to his Land Rover and placed her in the back. But Adrian didn't immediately bury his wife. Instead, he drove to the local pub. He went inside, had a few drinks, chatted with locals as though nothing had happened. Kate's body remained in the vehicle parked outside, while Adrian made small talk over his pint. Later that night, Adrian returned to Red Hill Farm. He drove his Land Rover deep into the property, to an area near the pheasant pens where the woodland was thick and undisturbed. He took a shovel and began to dig. The soil was damp from autumn rains, making the work heavy, but Adrian persisted, creating a hole deep enough to conceal what he'd done. He placed Kate's body in that hole, covered her with earth, and smoothed the ground. Then he returned to the farmhouse and went to bed. 5 days passed. During those 5 days, Adrian sent a text message to Diane Bellamy, the house sitter who'd been the source of so much tension. The message was simple and direct. He told her he was in love with her. Kate's family grew concerned when they couldn't reach her. Her brother, Richard Wakefield, called the house repeatedly. Where was Kate? Why wasn't she answering her phone? On the 10th of November, after persistent pressure from Richard, Adrian finally reported Kate missing. He told police that she'd stormed out after an argument, that she'd left to wind him up as she'd done before. He claimed she sometimes disappeared for days at a time to make a point. But something didn't add up. When police arrived at Red Hill Farm to investigate, they found Kate's purse, her mobile phone, her bank cards, her passport, her shoes, her clothes, all the things a person would take if they were truly leaving. Kate's diary was there too, sitting in the house, its pages filled with her increasingly desperate observations about her marriage. Her car hadn't been moved. No money had been withdrawn from her accounts. After the 4th of November, the last confirmed activity from Kate was a phone call she'd made to her bank, First Direct, on November 5th. After that, complete silence. Police became suspicious immediately. People don't vanish into thin air without taking anything. Richard Wakefield told investigators his sister would never have disappeared without letting him know. They were close. She wouldn't have worried him like this. Adrian was arrested. For 15 months, he remained on bail while police conducted one of the most extensive searches in Gloucestershire history. Over 100 officers descended on Red Hill Farm. They brought mechanical diggers, ground-penetrating radar, specialist search dogs. They examined every inch of the 276 acres. They even sifted through animal dung, concerned that Adrian might have disposed of Kate's body by feeding her to the pigs or other farm animals. It was a grotesque thought, but investigators had to consider every possibility. Despite all this effort, they found nothing. No body. No significant forensic evidence. No definitive proof of murder. But police had Kate's diary. They had the testimony of Diane Bellamy, who described a strange encounter with Adrian shortly after Kate's disappearance. When she'd asked Adrian where his wife was, he'd said something cryptic. "Don't ask me, they've taken her away." Who were they? The statement made no sense. Police had the evidence of Kate's withdrawal of £14,000, her determination to fight for a fair divorce settlement. They had the timeline of events, the text message to Diane, the 5-day delay in reporting Kate missing. But most of all, they had Kate's own words from her diary, documenting a marriage in crisis, describing violent rows and threats, recording her fear. In February 2009, Adrian was released from custody. There simply wasn't enough physical evidence to charge him. He returned to Red Hill Farm and attempted to resume his life. That's when he met Debbie Garlick. Debbie was a divorced mother of 2 from the nearby village of Course. She met Adrian in a pub in Staunton just a month after Kate's disappearance. By May of 2008, they were dating. By June of 2009, they were engaged. Adrian maintained his innocence completely. He told Debbie he had nothing to do with Kate's disappearance. He claimed his wife had staged the whole thing to frame him, to punish him for refusing to give her what she wanted in the divorce. Debbie believed him, but then, in March 2009, police decided they had enough circumstantial evidence to proceed. Adrian was arrested again, this time charged with murder. The trial began in January 2010 at Bristol Crown Court. Debbie attended every day, even though she'd just given birth to Adrian's daughter, Evie. A week before proceedings started, she sat in the courtroom with the infant, a show of support for the man she loved. The prosecution built their case on Kate's diary. They walked the jury through the progression of the marriage's breakdown. They highlighted Kate's fears, her documentation of threats, her growing conviction that Adrian was dangerous. They presented evidence of the bitter divorce dispute, £600,000 versus £800,000. The £14,000 withdrawal on November 4th. Kate's determination not to back down. They showed that Adrian had sent a love message to Diane Bellamy. On the very day Kate disappeared, they demonstrated that he'd waited 5 days to report her missing, and only did so after being pushed by Kate's brother. They emphasized that Kate had left behind everything she would have needed. Money, phone, passport, clothes. No reasonable person would believe she'd simply walked away. The defense argued that without a body, there was no proof of murder. Adrian's daughter from his first marriage, Laura, testified on his behalf. She was 19 years old and devastated by the accusations against her father. She told the court her father was incapable of such an act, that Kate must be alive somewhere, hiding. Debbie Garlick supported this theory. She genuinely believed Kate had faked her disappearance to frame Adrian, that she was somewhere waiting for the perfect moment to return and expose the injustice. But the jury didn't agree. After 14 hours of deliberation, they reached their verdict: guilty of murder. The vote was 10 to 1. Mr. Justice Nigel Davis sentenced Adrian Prout to life in prison with a minimum term of 18 years. But the judge added something unusual. Because Adrian refused to reveal where Kate's body was located, he added 3 additional years to the minimum sentence. The message was clear: if you won't show remorse, if you won't help this family find closure, you'll serve longer. Still, Adrian maintained his innocence, and still his supporters believed him. Debbie Garlick launched a campaign called Justice for Adrian Prout. She gathered over 1,000 signatures on a petition declaring his innocence. She offered a £10,000 reward for any information that would lead to his acquittal and release. The campaign adopted a slogan: no body, no proof, no justice. Adrian's daughter, Laura, was equally determined. She gave interviews declaring her father couldn't be a killer, that Kate would eventually return and clear his name. For more than a year after the conviction, Adrian Prout sat in his prison cell and said nothing about where Kate's body might be. The family's suffering continued. Richard Wakefield made public pleas, begging Adrian to reveal his sister's location so they could give her a proper burial, so they could have some measure of peace. But Adrian remained silent. Then something unexpected happened. Debbie Garlick, still convinced of Adrian's innocence, came up with an idea. She suggested that Adrian take a lie detector test, a polygraph. The test wasn't admissible in British courts, but she thought it could prove his innocence to the world, could vindicate him in the court of public opinion. Adrian agreed. He was confident, perhaps too confident. After all, he'd maintained his story for years. He'd looked his daughter in the eye and proclaimed his innocence. He'd convinced Debbie, convinced numerous supporters. He'd withstood police interrogations, a trial, years of imprisonment. Surely he could pass a polygraph test. The test was conducted in prison. Electrodes were attached to Adrian's body, measuring his heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, skin conductivity. The examiner asked a series of questions, starting with control questions to establish baseline responses, then moving to specific queries about Kate's disappearance and death. As the test progressed, the examiner watched the readings. The machine detected physiological responses, spikes in stress levels, indicators of her deception. When it was over, the examiner looked at Adrian Prout directly and said 5 words that changed everything. "I'm looking at a murderer." Adrian had failed spectacularly. The confident facade crumbled. Something in him broke. Perhaps it was the weight of the lie, carried for so many years. Perhaps it was the inescapable proof that his body betrayed the truth, even when his words did not. Shortly after the failed polygraph test, Adrian confessed to Debbie. He admitted what he'd done. He told her he had killed Kate Prout. Debbie was devastated. She'd staked everything on his innocence. She'd had his child. She'd campaigned publicly for his release. And now she learned it was all based on a lie. Debbie contacted the police. On November 17th, 2011, 4 years after Kate's murder, Adrian Prout finally agreed to show authorities where he'd buried his wife. Handcuffed to a police officer, Adrian was transported from his prison to Red Hill Farm. The farm had been sold. New owners occupied the property. The police needed access to the woodland where Adrian claimed he'd buried Kate. The scene was carefully managed. Police erected barriers, closed off paths. Adrian was driven deep into the property in a 4-wheel drive vehicle, accompanied by officers and detectives. When they reached the area near the pheasant pens, Adrian indicated a spot in the woodland. "There," he said. "That's where I buried her." The search began immediately. Detective Superintendent Simon Atkinson, who'd led the investigation from the beginning, brought in the best resources available. A team from Specialist Group International, leading experts in forensic search and recovery, was called in. Body search dogs from South Yorkshire were deployed. Ground-penetrating radar was used to scan beneath the surface. 2 mechanical diggers worked in tandem with 2 teams of forensic archaeologists who carefully assessed the geography of the land. The work was painstaking, methodical. You cannot rush the recovery of human remains. Every inch of soil must be examined, every fragment documented. It took days, but on November 18th, 2011, Detective Superintendent Atkinson made an announcement. We have found human remains close to the location Adrian Prout identified as the place he buried his wife. After 4 years of searching, of wondering, of hoping against hope, Kate Prout had been found. Richard Wakefield and Kate's family were informed immediately. The news was bittersweet. They'd always known Kate was dead, had accepted that reality long ago, but now they could finally bring her home. They could give her a proper funeral, a proper burial. They could say goodbye. Kate's funeral took place in Cheltenham in January 2012. Friends, family, and members of the community gathered to mourn a woman who'd sought nothing more than a peaceful life in the countryside, who died because she dared to ask for what was rightfully hers. Adrian Prout remains in prison. His minimum sentence will keep him there until at least 2028. His daughter Evie, born just before his trial, has grown up without her father. His older daughter Laura eventually had to accept the truth she'd fought so hard against. Debbie Garlick, who'd loved him and believed in him, had to come to terms with the fact that she'd been deceived by a murderer, that the man she'd planned to marry had strangled his wife and hidden her body in the ground while courting her. The case of Kate Prout raises uncomfortable questions about how much we can truly know another person, about the facades people maintain, about the violence that can hide behind a charming smile and countryside respectability. Kate had documented her fears in her diary. She'd called the police, she'd sought legal help, she'd done everything a person is supposed to do when they recognize danger, and still she couldn't escape. Her brother Richard has spoken publicly about the ordeal, about the years of not knowing, of searching, of begging Adrian to reveal the truth. He's expressed relief that Kate was finally found, that they could lay her to rest with dignity. The farm where Kate died, where she'd once walked with her dogs and arranged flowers and dreamed of a peaceful retirement, passed to new owners. Life at Red Hill Farm continued, the land indifferent to the tragedy it had witnessed. The Gloucestershire countryside remains beautiful. Church spires still pierce the morning mist. Narrow lanes still wind between ancient villages. Pheasant shoots still take place on autumn weekends. The seasons continue their eternal cycle, but somewhere in that landscape, in a quiet cemetery, Kate Prout finally rests. A retired teacher who wanted nothing more than to live simply, to work with clay and walk in the fields. A woman who asked for fairness and paid for it with her life. And perhaps as you drift towards sleep tonight, you'll spare a thought for Kate, for her love of nature, for her creative spirit, for her courage in standing up for herself, even when it cost her everything. Sometimes the most dangerous place isn't a dark alley in a city. Sometimes it's a beautiful farmhouse in the countryside, where rolling green fields hide dark secrets, and where dreams can become nightmares. Rest well, Kate Prout. Your story is told, your memory preserved, your truth finally known. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're going to explore a story that raises difficult questions about love, control, and the thin line between accident and intention. This is a story that unfolded in the autumn of 2014, in a small apartment in Lakewood, Washington. It's a story about two young people who seemed to have their whole lives ahead of them and how everything changed in a single moment. So take a deep breath, let the day's worries fade away, and let me tell you about Danielle Nemetz. Danielle Ripion came into this world on January 11th, 1995, 7 weeks early. She was so small, so fragile, that the doctors weren't certain she would survive. But Danielle was a fighter from the very beginning. Her family called her their little miracle baby. Life, however, had difficult lessons waiting for young Danielle. When she was only 2 years old, her mother, Tara, lost her battle with cancer. Danielle was too young to understand death, too young to hold on to clear memories of the woman who brought her into the world. Instead, she would grow up with only photographs and the stories others told her. After her mother's death, Danielle went to live with her grandmother, Scarlett Ripion, in McKinleyville, California. Scarlett became the center of Danielle's world. In her grandmother's home, Danielle found stability, warmth, and the maternal love she desperately needed. Money was tight, but love was abundant. Scarlett raised Danielle and her siblings with care, doing everything she could to fill the void their mother had left behind. But life would test Danielle again. When Danielle was 14 years old, her grandmother passed away. The loss devastated her. Scarlett had been her anchor, her safe harbor, and now that too was gone. Danielle and her siblings moved in with their stepfather, Michael Bolton, who adopted them. But the home life wasn't the same. Michael had his own struggles, and Danielle once again found herself searching for that sense of belonging she had briefly known with her grandmother. At McKinleyville High School, Danielle found an escape. She poured herself into cheerleading. At just 5 feet tall and weighing around 100 pounds, she was the perfect size to be a flyer. The person who gets tossed and twirled high into the air by her teammates. Her coach, Aaron Mikolai, remembered her fondly. You couldn't help but smile watching Danielle perform. She belonged in the center of attention, radiating joy and energy. Despite the sadness that shadowed her life, Danielle chose happiness. She chose to smile. Danielle also loved makeup and beauty. She dreamed of someday opening her own nail salon, a place where she could make other people feel beautiful and confident. She had plans, dreams, hopes for the future. But there was something else Danielle searched for, something perhaps more urgently than anything else. She was looking for love, for family, for someone who would never leave her. Her best friend, Michelle Yingling, understood. Michelle had also lost her mother around the same time. Danielle lost her grandmother, and the two girls formed a deep bond. They understood each other's pain in ways no one else could, and Michelle noticed something about Danielle, a pattern that worried her. Every boyfriend Danielle dated became, in her mind, the one she was going to marry. Danielle was searching so desperately for permanence, for someone to build a life with, that she threw herself completely into each relationship. And then, in 2012, during her senior year of high school, Danielle met Skylar Nimitz. Skylar Nimitz grew up in Northern California, in Arcata. He had recently graduated from high school when he and Danielle first connected through Facebook. There was something magnetic between them from the start. Skylar had joined the United States Army and was preparing to leave for basic training in Georgia. But before he left, he wanted to meet this girl who had captured his attention online. They met in person on October 4th, 2012, at a high school football game where Danielle was cheering. The chemistry was instant. Skylar would later say he fell in love with her immediately, head over heels, all at once. Danielle felt the same way. She told her friends that she knew, without a doubt, that Skylar was the man she would marry. Just 1 month into their relationship, Skylar asked his mother, Danette Heller, if Danielle could move in with their family. Danette was taken aback by how quickly things were moving, but she could see that Danielle needed stability. She could see that this young girl had been through loss after loss, and perhaps their home could offer her the structure and family she craved. So Danette agreed. Danielle moved in with the Nimitz family, and the relationship between her and Skylar intensified. They were young, passionate, and convinced they had found their forever person. When Skylar left for basic training in Georgia, the separation was painful for both of them. They stayed in constant contact through text and calls, counting down the days until they could be together again. And then during Skylar's Christmas break, just 3 months after they first met, he proposed. He took Danielle to the top of Neelan Mountain, got down on one knee, and asked her to be his wife. Danielle said yes. On March 7th, 2013, the same day Skylar graduated from boot camp, the young couple went to a courthouse in Columbus, Georgia, and got married. Danielle was barely 18 years old. Skylar was 20. They moved to Lakewood, Washington, where Skylar was stationed at Joint Base Lewis McChord. They found a small 2-bedroom apartment off base. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Danielle dropped out of high school temporarily to make the move, but she was determined to finish, and she did. She graduated in 2014. Life as a military wife wasn't easy. Skylar was often away on training exercises for weeks at a time, leaving Danielle alone in their apartment. But she tried to make the best of it. She got a job, she made new friends. She stayed in touch with Michaela through video calls. And when Skylar was home, they spent their time together, enjoying each other's company. One of the things they did together was go shooting. Skylar had grown up around guns. His father had given him his first rifle when he was just a small child, and by the time he was 11 years old, he was already learning to shoot an AR-15. He was an expert marksman, trained by the military, knowledgeable about firearm safety in every possible way. Danielle enjoyed shooting too, mostly because it meant spending time with Skylar. For her 19th birthday, Skylar built her a custom AR-15 rifle in her favorite color, blue. It was a thoughtful gift, something personal, something that represented their shared hobby. But beneath the surface of their seemingly happy marriage, there were cracks beginning to form. To the outside world, Skylar and Danielle appeared to be a happy young couple navigating the challenges of military life. They posted pictures together on social media. They smiled. They held hands. But those who knew them more closely began to see troubling signs. Skylar had a jealous streak, a possessive nature that sometimes flared into something darker. He would send Danielle text messages accusing her of being unfaithful, of going on dates with other men, of not being honest with him. Danielle would deny these accusations, reassuring him of her love and loyalty. But the accusations didn't stop. According to some of Danielle's friends, Skylar was controlling. He monitored where she went, who she talked to, what she wore. He called her cruel names during arguments. There were loud fights that echoed through the thin walls of their apartment, fights that neighbors would later remember. The disputes almost always centered on Skylar's jealousy and his belief that Danielle was cheating on him. But Danielle, perhaps because she had already lost so much in her life, perhaps because she believed this marriage was her chance at the family she'd always wanted, defended Skylar. She told her friends that things were fine, that he loved her, that they were happy, and in truth, there were happy moments. Genuine moments of connection and joy between them. This wasn't a simple story of a villain and a victim. It was more complicated than that. Skylar and Danielle were two damaged young people who had found each other and were trying in their imperfect way to build something lasting. But the cracks kept widening. In late September of 2014, Skylar was sent on a 3-week training exercise to Yakima in eastern Washington. It was battlefield training, intense and demanding. The soldiers lived in striker vehicles, worked long hours, dealt with difficult terrain and challenging conditions. Skylar was ready to come home. Before he returned, he sent Danielle a text message. He asked her to pick up 2 bottles of alcohol for him, a bottle of Sailor Jerry's rum and a bottle of Fireball whiskey. Skylar was only 20 years old, not yet old enough to legally purchase alcohol. Danielle, 19, couldn't buy it either, so she would need to find someone who could. She reached out to Anthony Fies, a friend of Skylar's from his army unit. Anthony was over 21, and seemed like the logical choice. But Anthony was heading home early, days before the rest of the unit. And in the rush, he forgot. He never bought the alcohol. When Danielle realized Anthony hadn't come through, she panicked slightly. Skylar really wanted those bottles waiting for him when he got home. So Danielle asked 2 other men to help her. One of them was Jeremy Henry, an old friend from her past who had recently been stationed at Fort Lewis. Danielle got the bottles. Mission accomplished. She didn't think much of it, but she never told Skylar exactly who had purchased them for her. October 16th, 2014, started as a good day. Skylar's training exercise was finally over, and he was coming home. That morning, Danielle video chatted with her best friend, Michaela. She was excited, practically glowing with happiness. She couldn't wait for Skylar to get back. She had missed him terribly during the 3 weeks he was gone. Danielle met Skylar at the base that afternoon and drove him home to their apartment. They ordered pizza to celebrate his return. Skylar poured himself a shot of Sailor Jerry's, then mixed Fireball with Red Bull. He drank. He was buzzed, he would later admit, but not drunk. Tired from the training, but in a good mood. Happy to be home with his wife. Later that evening, Danielle video chatted with Michaela again. This time, Michaela could see both Danielle and Skylar. Danielle was sitting at her computer desk. Skylar was on the couch in the background. Danielle seemed joyful. At one point, she ran over to Skylar and jumped on his lap, acting playful and happy that he was home. Michaela hung up the call around 6:30 in the evening. 12 minutes later, Danielle was dead. What exactly happened in those 12 minutes is something only one person truly knows. According to Skylar's account, he went into their bedroom and saw Danielle's blue AR-15 rifle in the closet. He picked it up, intending to clear it, to check if it was loaded. This was standard procedure for someone who knew guns as well as he did. You always check. You always make sure. But somehow, according to Skylar, the rifle discharged. The bullet traveled across the small apartment, through the air, and struck Danielle in the back of the head, as she sat at her computer desk. She was only 5 feet away. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Danielle slumped forward over the keyboard. Skylar stood there, the rifle in his hands, staring at what he had done. The neighbors across the hall heard the gunshot. They called 911 immediately. When the police arrived moments later, they found Skylar outside the apartment, visibly distraught. One officer approached him. Skylar looked at the officer and said, "I need to tell someone my story." He was handcuffed and placed in the back of a police vehicle. The dashboard camera recorded everything he said. He was crying, almost hysterical. "My wife is dead. My wife. What do I do? Just kill me. Just kill me. My wife, my love." Over and over, he repeated variations of these words. "I'm a bad person. I'm a bad person." And then, strangely, "I'm innocent. I didn't mean to hurt anybody." Inside the apartment, paramedics confirmed what Skylar already knew. Danielle was gone. There was nothing anyone could do. But as the police began to investigate, they noticed things that troubled them. There wasn't a single drop of Danielle's blood on Skylar's clothes or hands. If he had rushed to her side immediately after the shooting, tried to help her, held her, checked for a pulse, surely there would have been blood, but there was none. Skylar hadn't called 911. The neighbors had. Why hadn't he immediately called for help? And then there were the bottles. The 2 bottles of alcohol that Danielle had purchased. They were empty. Skylar had poured them out and thrown them off the balcony before the police arrived. Why would he do that? What was he trying to hide? The police also found the rifle back in the closet, placed carefully where it had been before. If this was truly an accident, wouldn't Skylar have dropped the weapon immediately? Wouldn't he have been focused entirely on his wife? Something didn't add up. Skylar was taken to the Lakewood Police Department for questioning. For the next 7.5 hours, detective interrogated him, trying to understand what had happened in that apartment. Skylar's story was consistent in its basic outline. He had picked up the rifle to check if it was loaded. It went off. He didn't mean to hurt Danielle. It was an accident. A terrible, tragic accident. But the detectives pressed him. "You're an expert with firearms. You've been trained by the military. You've been around guns your entire life. How does someone like you make a mistake like this?" Skylar struggled to explain. He was tired. He had been drinking. He wasn't thinking clearly. He just made a mistake. The detectives also asked him about his relationship with Danielle. They had heard things. Rumors. Concerns. They asked about his jealousy, his controlling behavior, the fights neighbors had heard. Skylar denied being a jealous person. He said he loved Danielle more than anything in the world. They had their problems, like any couple, but they were working through them. And then the detectives brought up the bottles. They asked Skylar if he knew who had purchased the alcohol for Danielle. Skylar said he thought his friend Anthony Fass had bought them, but that wasn't true. The detectives told him. Anthony didn't buy those bottles. Someone else did. Did Skylar know who? This was the moment everything hinged on. The prosecution's theory of the case centered on one crucial witness, Anthony Fass. Anthony testified that on the day Skylar returned from training, he ran into him on base. Skylar thanked him for buying the alcohol, but Anthony told him he hadn't purchased it. Someone else had. According to Anthony, Skylar's entire demeanor changed in that moment. He became angry. His hands started shaking. His face flushed. Anthony could see the rage building. This, the prosecutors argued, was the motive. Skylar was a jealous, controlling husband who became enraged when he learned that his wife had turned to other men he didn't know about, to buy alcohol. In his mind, this was proof of betrayal. Proof that she was keeping things from him. Maybe even proof that she was being unfaithful. The prosecutors believed that Skylar went home that day, stewed in his anger for those 12 minutes after the video call with Michaela ended, picked up the rifle and shot his wife in a fit of jealous rage. Then he tried to cover it up by making it look like an accident, pouring out the bottles to eliminate evidence of what had triggered his anger. They charged him with first-degree murder, but there was a problem with this theory. Anthony Fies was the only person who testified to seeing Skylar angry that day. No one else saw it. Not the other soldiers on base. Not Danielle's friend Michaela during the video call. No one. In fact, every other witness said Skylar seemed happy that day, excited to be home, looking forward to seeing his wife. Another Army buddy, Richard Oakley, testified that he didn't even see Anthony Foss on base that day. He said Skylar was in a great mood, talking about how much he missed Danielle. And when Skylar took the stand in his own defense, he flatly denied ever having a conversation with Anthony Fies about the alcohol. He said it never happened. So who was telling the truth? The trial of Skylar Nemitz took place in Tacoma, Washington. A year and a half after Danielle's death, the courtroom was packed with family members, friends, reporters, and curious onlookers. On one side sat Skylar's mother, Danette Heller, who believed with every fiber of her being that her son was telling the truth. On the other side sat Danielle's family, including her younger sister, Michaela, who had looked up to Danielle as a mother figure. The prosecution painted Skylar as a dangerous, controlling abuser who had killed his wife in a jealous rage. They presented text messages showing Skylar's possessive behavior. They called witnesses who testified to the frequent fights. They brought in forensic experts who explained how unlikely it was that an expert marksman like Skylar could accidentally discharge a weapon in the exact direction of his wife's head from 5 feet away. The prosecutor held up the AR-15 rifle in the courtroom, demonstrating how Skylar would have had to pick it up from the bed, walk over to where Danielle was sitting, orient the barrel directly at the back of her head, and pull the trigger. Why would anyone do that while supposedly just checking if a weapon was loaded? The defense, led by attorney Michael Stewart, admitted that Skylar was responsible for Danielle's death. They couldn't deny that, but they argued it was manslaughter, not murder. It was a reckless, negligent accident, not an intentional killing. There was no premeditation, no plan, just a terrible mistake made by a tired, buzzed young man who thought he was safe. Stewart pointed out the lack of evidence showing a fight or confrontation in those crucial 12 minutes. If Skylar had been seething with rage, if he had confronted Danielle and shot her deliberately, surely there would be some sign of it. But there was nothing. The apartment was quiet. The neighbors heard nothing until the gunshot itself. And then there was Anthony Foss, the prosecution's star witness. Stewart attacked his credibility, pointing out that no one else could corroborate his story about seeing Skylar angry on base that day. When Skylar took the stand, he broke down in tears multiple times. He told the jury he loved Danielle more than anything. He never meant to hurt her. He would give anything to take back that moment, to have checked the rifle differently, to have been more careful. I can live with being the reason Danielle died, he said, his voice breaking, but I can't live with being called a murderer. The prosecution cross-examined him aggressively, trying to catch him in contradictions, trying to break through what they believed was a rehearsed performance. But Skylar stuck to his story. The jury deliberated for 7 long days. After a week of deliberations, the jury reached a verdict. They found Skylar Nemitz guilty of first-degree manslaughter. Not first-degree murder, as the prosecution had hoped, but not the lesser charge of second-degree manslaughter either. They landed in the middle. When the verdict was read, Skylar broke down in tears. His mother, Danette, cried as well. On the other side of the courtroom, Danielle's family had mixed reactions. They were glad Skylar was being held accountable, but they believed it should have been murder. Later, jurors spoke to reporters about their decision. They said they simply couldn't be certain beyond a reasonable doubt that Skylar had intended to kill Danielle. Anthony Foss was the only witness who claimed Skylar was angry that day, and his testimony was contradicted by others. Without that evidence of rage in those crucial 12 minutes before the shooting, they couldn't say it was premeditated murder, but they also didn't believe it was a simple accident. Skylar was too experienced with firearms, too well trained, too knowledgeable about gun safety. For him to accidentally point a loaded rifle at his wife's head and pull the trigger was, in their view, criminally reckless. One juror, a retired army soldier himself, said it simply: "You never point a weapon in the direction of anybody and pull the trigger believing it's unloaded." The jury convicted Schuyler of first-degree manslaughter with a firearm enhancement. On March 26, 2016, Judge Jack Nevin sentenced Schuyler Nemetz to the maximum penalty allowed under the law, 13.5 years in prison. At the sentencing, Judge Nevin looked directly at Schuyler and repeated twice, "Mr. Nemetz, you are an expert. You are an expert." The judge was emphasizing the central issue of the case. This wasn't some random person unfamiliar with guns. This was someone who had been trained, who knew better, who should never have made such a fatal error. Schuyler addressed the court before his sentencing. "I can't accept the actions that I've done," he said. His voice was quiet, defeated. There was nothing left to fight for. The jury had decided. The judge had decided. All that remained was to serve his time. Danielle's sister, Mikala, attended the sentencing with purple hair, died in honor of Danielle's favorite color. She told reporters that while she wished the verdict had been first-degree murder, at least Schuyler had received the maximum sentence. Schuyler's mother, Danette Heller, sat in the courtroom with her heart breaking. She had fought so hard for her son, believing in his innocence, making video diaries about her fears and loneliness. Now she had to watch him be taken away to prison. "I'm really broken-hearted right now," she said after the sentencing. Schuyler Nemetz is currently serving his sentence in a Washington state prison. With good behavior, he could be released earlier than the full 13.5 years, though the 5-year firearm enhancement cannot be reduced. Danielle Nemetz was laid to rest in Greenwood Cemetery in Arcata, California, next to her beloved grandmother, Scarlett Ripion. The two women who had experienced such loss in life now rest side by side. But this case, even with its verdict and its sentence, leaves us with questions that may never be fully answered. Was it truly an accident?
As Schuyler claimed?
Was he simply a young man who made a terrible mistake, who picked up a rifle without thinking, who was tired and buzzed and careless in a way that cost his wife her life? Or was it intentional, as the prosecution argued? Was Schuyler a jealous, controlling husband who discovered his wife had turned to other men for help, who spent those 12 minutes after the video call working himself into a rage, who then picked up a rifle and shot her in the back of the head? The jury couldn't decide with certainty, so they chose the middle ground. Criminally reckless. Manslaughter. Not murder, but not a pure accident either. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Perhaps Schuyler didn't plan to kill Danielle, didn't wake up that day intending to become a killer. But perhaps in a moment of anger or suspicion or jealousy, he picked up that rifle and made a choice that he can never take back. Perhaps he pointed it at her, not quite sure what he was going to do, and in that split second his finger pulled the trigger. Or perhaps it really was an accident. Perhaps he was just checking the rifle, and it went off, and in that instant everything he loved was gone. We will never know with absolute certainty what happened in those 12 minutes in that small apartment in Lakewood, Washington. What we do know is that a young woman who had already experienced so much loss in her short life lost everything. Danielle Nemetz, who was born 7 weeks early and called a miracle baby, who lost her mother at 2 and her grandmother at 14, who searched so desperately for love and belonging, that she married at 18, who dreamed of opening a nail salon and traveling the world, who loved cheerleading and makeup and spending time with her friends. She was 19 years old when she died. And we know that a young man, whether through intention or catastrophic negligence, took her life. Schuyler Nemetz, who grew up around guns and knew them better than most people, who fell in love quickly and intensely, who had jealousy issues and control problems, but also by some accounts genuinely loved his wife. 2 young lives, both damaged in different ways, came together and created something that ended in tragedy. The case of Danielle Nemetz reminds us that domestic violence exists on a spectrum. It's not always clear-cut. Sometimes it's loud and obvious. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's text messages and jealous accusations and slow erosion of freedom. And sometimes, whether through rage or recklessness, it ends in death. It reminds us that expertise doesn't prevent accidents, but it does make them far less likely. And an expert makes a mistake with deadly consequences, we have to ask ourselves, was it really a mistake? And it reminds us that the justice system, for all its efforts to find truth, can only do so much. Juries deliberate, judges sentence, prison doors close. But the deepest truths of what happens between two people in private moments may remain forever unknowable. Danielle's family has tried to keep her memory alive. They remember her infectious smile, her bubbly personality, her dreams for the future. They remember the little girl who was so small she could fly through the air as a cheerleading flyer. The teenager who loved her friends and her family fiercely. The young woman who just wanted to feel like she belonged somewhere. Skylar's family remembers a different version of events. They remember a loving husband who made a terrible mistake, who will have to live with that guilt for the rest of his life. The truth, as it often does in these cases, lies somewhere in the complicated space between those two narratives. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll think about Danielle, about a life cut short, about the fragility of everything we hold dear, about how a single moment can change everything forever. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we travel to the other side of the world, to the sunlit shores of Sydney, Australia, where the harbor sparkles beneath endless blue skies and modern high-rises stand beside quiet residential streets. It's a city of possibility, a place where people from around the globe come to build new lives and chase their dreams. This is the story of one such dreamer, a woman who crossed oceans to create something better for herself. A woman whose intelligence, warmth, and determination touched everyone she met. But this is also a story about the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. About the thin line between love and obsession. And about how sometimes when someone decides to leave, another person refuses to let them go. Tonight we remember Cecilia Haddad. Let the story unfold gently, like pages turning in an old book. There's no rush. Just listen, and let sleep find you when it's ready. Cecilia Moller Haddad was born in Brazil, into a family that called Rio de Janeiro home. Her father, Jose Ibrahim Haddad, and her mother, Milu Moller, raised Cecilia and her brother Joao in the vibrant, bustling energy of one of South America's most beautiful cities. From an early age, Cecilia showed remarkable drive and intelligence. She wasn't content to simply drift through life. She wanted to build something, to contribute, to make a difference. In the year 2002, Cecilia graduated from the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro with a degree in business and logistics. But she didn't stop there. Education was important to her. She pursued a master's degree in industrial engineering, specializing in logistics, completing it in 2007. By then, she had already accumulated years of experience in supply chain management, marketing, and operation. Cecilia spoke 3 languages fluently: Portuguese, English, and Spanish. She was the kind of person who could walk into any room and command respect, not through force but through competence and genuine warmth. In mid-2007, at the age of 27, Cecilia made a decision that would change her life. She boarded a plane bound for Australia. On that flight, she struck up a conversation with another Brazilian woman, Carol Camara, who was also heading to Perth for work. The two became instant friends, bonded by their shared journey into the unknown. They stayed in touch as they both began building lives in their adopted country. Australia offered Cecilia opportunities she had dreamed of. She settled first in Perth, Western Australia, where she secured a position as a supply chain manager for BHP Billiton, one of the world's largest mining companies. She worked at their integrated remote operations center, managing complex logistics networks across vast distances. It was challenging work requiring precision, foresight, and the ability to coordinate dozens of moving parts. Cecilia excelled at it. Over the next several years, she built a reputation as someone who got things done. Friends and colleagues described her as vibrant, outgoing, and deeply professional. She had a large circle of friends and an active social life. She attended industry conferences, gave presentations, and became a respected figure in Australia's resources sector. By all accounts, Cecilia was living the life she had envisioned for herself. In 2016, Nearly a decade after arriving in Australia, Cecilia made another move. She relocated to Sydney, on the country's east coast, to take a position as head of operational planning for Pacific National, a major freight and logistics company. Sydney suited her. The city was cosmopolitan, diverse, and full of energy. She rented an apartment in Ryde, a suburb on the lower North Shore, just a few kilometers from the Lane Cove River. But Cecilia's ambitions didn't stop with corporate work. She had always dreamed of running her own business. In early 2018, after leaving Pacific National, she founded CHC Consulting. It was her own venture, built on her years of expertise. She was finally her own boss, charting her own course. Everything seemed to be falling into place. There was, however, one complication in her life. One shadow that refused to fade. During her time in Sydney, Cecilia met a man. His name was Mario Marcelo Santoro. Like Cecilia, Mario was Brazilian. He was an engineer, a few years older than her, in his early 40s. The two had actually crossed paths years before in Brazil, both attending the same university, the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. But it wasn't until they were both living in Sydney that they reconnected and began a relationship. At first, things seemed normal. Mario had children from a previous marriage back in Brazil. 2 daughters he cared about deeply. He and Cecilia both worked at a disability service provider called Higher Up, supporting people with disabilities in their daily lives. They even formed a business partnership together, registering a company called D Care, which listed Cecilia's apartment in Ryde as its address. They were building something together, or so it seemed. But relationships are complex, and not all of them are what they appear to be on the surface. As time passed, Cecilia began to see a different side of Mario. He could be controlling, possessive. He didn't have steady employment, and according to Cecilia's family, he relied heavily on her income. Despite this, when Cecilia tried to end the relationship, Mario refused to accept it. He had nowhere else to go. He said he needed to stay in her apartment because he had to send money back to Brazil to pay for his daughter's school fees. Cecilia, compassionate and generous as always, allowed him to remain, even though the relationship had ended. But this arrangement created an unbearable tension. Cecilia felt trapped in her own home. She confided in her parents, her friends, her stepmother. She told them she was afraid of Mario. She described his behavior as threatening, his presence as suffocating. There were arguments. There were confrontations. On one occasion, Cecilia returned home after staying with friends for several days. Uncertain whether Mario would be there, she called her father, Jose, as she approached her apartment. She stayed on the phone with him as she unlocked the door. Her heart pounded when she entered and found the apartment empty. She exhaled with relief. "He's not here, Dad," she said. "You can sleep now." But this was no way to live. About 10 days before the end of April 2018, Cecilia gave Mario an ultimatum. She told him he had to leave. She couldn't do this anymore. If he refused, she said she would call the police. Mario, however, still had his passport inside the apartment. He needed it to return to Brazil, to visit his family. The situation was reaching a breaking point. Then came Friday, April 27th. That Friday evening, Cecilia attended a barbecue with friends. She was seen laughing, talking, enjoying herself. It was the kind of ordinary, pleasant evening that people take for granted, never knowing it might be their last. After the barbecue ended, Cecilia returned home. She was alone. The next morning, Saturday, April 28th, Cecilia spoke to several friends. Her last known phone call was made between 8 and 9:30 in the morning. She told people she had plans, appointments to keep. Everything seemed normal, but at lunchtime that Saturday, something happened. Cecilia called her mother, Miliu Muller, back in Brazil. Her mother had recently undergone heart surgery, and the two spoke regularly. But this call was different. During their conversation, Miliu heard something in the background that made her blood run cold. Someone was banging on Cecilia's door. Violently, aggressively, like someone trying to break in. "Open the door," a man's voice screamed. "I want to talk to you." Miliu recognized the voice immediately. It was Mario. "Cecilia, what is that man doing there?" Miliu asked. her voice rising with panic. "Call the police." But Cecilia tried to reassure her mother. She didn't want to worry her. Not after her recent surgery. "It's okay, Mom," she said. "I'm meeting a friend for lunch soon. I'll text you as soon as I'm with them." "Promise me," Milou insisted. "I promise." But Cecilia never sent that text. She never met her friend for lunch, and by the following morning her friends were frantic. Cecilia had missed multiple appointments on Saturday, something completely out of character for her. She was the kind of person who never missed commitments, especially professional ones. When calls went unanswered and texts remained unread, her friends contacted the police. Meanwhile, Mario had changed his flight plans. He was supposed to return to Brazil later, but suddenly on April 28th he moved his departure up. He boarded a plane that very day, flying back to Rio de Janeiro. By the time Sunday morning came around, he was already thousands of miles away across the Pacific Ocean. That Sunday morning, April 29th, dawned clear and bright over Sydney. Two kayakers were paddling along the Lane Cove River in Woolwich, enjoying the peaceful waters, when they saw something that made them stop. There, floating near the riverbank, was a body. It was a woman, fully clothed in a navy and green long-sleeve jumper and khaki cargo pants. She wore silver bracelets on both wrists. She had a tattoo on her right shoulder blade and a birthmark on her left shin. The kayakers immediately called emergency services. Police arrived within minutes, pulling the body from the water. It was discovered around 10:10 in the morning, approximately 6 kilometers from Cecilia's apartment in Ryde. The woman was identified as Cecilia Haddad. She was 38 years old. At first, authorities weren't certain what had happened. Perhaps it was an accident. Perhaps she had fallen into the river somehow. But as investigators began piecing together the timeline, the truth started to emerge. This was no accident. Detective Acting Inspector Richie Sim of the New South Wales Police Homicide Squad spoke to the media. He explained that Cecilia had been at a barbecue Friday night and had spoken to friends Saturday morning, but her movements after that were unknown. Police were specifically seeking anyone who might have seen Cecilia or her car, a red 2013 Fiat 500 with a black roof, in the Hunters Hill Ryde or Woolwich areas over the weekend. Detectives searched Cecilia's apartment on Ann Street in Ryde. They found no obvious signs of a struggle, but they did find evidence that someone had been there recently. They also learned about Mario Santoro and his sudden departure to Brazil. When they tried to contact him, they saw photos of him on social media, already in Rio de Janeiro posing with his 2 daughters. He claimed he had returned early because his father was ill and needed surgery. But investigators weren't buying it. Cellular phone tracking revealed Mario's location on the day of Cecilia's death. The data showed he had been at Cecilia's apartment, and then near the Lane Cove River, exactly where her body was discovered. Security camera footage showed Mario driving Cecilia's car during the time she went missing. Forensic analysis found sand and vegetation from the riverbank area inside the car. The evidence was mounting. But there was a problem. Mario was in Brazil, and Brazil does not extradite its own citizens to face charges in other countries. If justice was to be served, it would have to happen in Brazil. On June 27, 2018, New South Wales police secured an arrest warrant for Mario Santoro. They coordinated with Brazilian federal police through a complex international legal process. On July 7th, just over 2 months after Cecilia's death, Brazilian authorities arrested Mario at a relative's home in the Botafogo neighborhood of Rio de Janeiro. He had been hiding there, trying to avoid detection. He was taken into custody and transferred to the Benfica Penitentiary, one of Rio's most notorious maximum security prisons. The investigation now entered a new phase, but it would be a long, difficult road to justice. Over the next 5 years, detectives from New South Wales worked closely with their Brazilian counterparts to build a case. Detective Sergeant Hannah Packer and Detective Inspector John Edwards flew to Brazil multiple times, carrying more than 3,000 pages of evidence, over 300 witness statements, and extensive CCTV footage. They were determined to deliver justice for Cecilia and her family. During this time, Cecilia's family endured unimaginable pain. Her mother, Milou, worn down by grief and her own health problems, could barely function. She called Mario a monster, someone who had lived off her daughter's earnings and then taken her life. Cecilia's father, Jose, became embroiled in legal battles over her estate, which included properties in Queensland and Western Australia, as well as life insurance and superannuation estimated at over $1.8 million. Her estranged husband, Felipe Torres, also entered the legal proceedings, as the two had been separated but not yet officially divorced at the time of her death. But more than money, what Cecilia's family wanted was accountability. They wanted Mario to admit what he had done. In Brazil, the legal process moved slowly. There were pre-trial hearings where Mario appeared calm, almost attached. He answered questions from his defense lawyers, but refused to speak to prosecutors. His attorneys argued that an alleged informal confession he had supposedly made to police was never properly recorded, and therefore inadmissible. They claimed he was innocent. At one hearing in 2018, Mario explained that he and Cecilia had met at university years before. He admitted they had been dating for about a year before she ended the relationship. He claimed his trip to Brazil had been planned in advance, that he needed to see his sick father. When asked why he didn't have a return ticket to Australia, he said he had planned to fly to Chile with his children and his mother, and they were all going to meet Cecilia there. None of it made sense. The evidence contradicted his story at every turn, but still, he refused to confess. Finally, in June of 2023, more than 5 years after Cecilia's death, Mario Santoro stood trial in a federal court in Rio de Janeiro. The jury consisted of 7 people, 6 women and 1 man. They listened to days of testimony from detectives, forensic experts, and Cecilia's heartbroken family members. They reviewed the mountain of evidence that Australian and Brazilian investigators had painstakingly assembled. Throughout the trial, Mario appeared relatively calm, almost relaxed. He sat quietly as witness after witness described the evidence against him. He seemed unmoved. Then came Wednesday, June 21st, 2023. Mario took the stand to testify. He acknowledged that he had gone to Cecilia's apartment that Saturday to retrieve his passport so he could catch his flight back to Brazil. He admitted they had gotten into a fight, and then finally, he told the truth. "I grabbed her neck," he said, his voice breaking. "I squeezed really hard. I was trying to make her shut up, but unfortunately that's when the tragedy happened. I didn't want to do that." He described how Cecilia fell limp in his arms, how the life left her body. For the first time during the trial, Mario cried. A federal judge, Ian Legay Vermelho, would later note the significance of this confession. The defendant only confessed in the jury room after extensive evidentiary material had been produced against him, the judge said. In other words, he did not confess before the Australian police when he arrived in Brazil. He did not confess before the Brazilian investigators, nor before the judicial stages he had gone through up to that day. In other words, Mario only admitted the truth when he realized there was no escape. When the walls had finally closed in, the next morning, Thursday, June 22nd, 2023, the jury delivered its verdicts. Mario Marcelo Santoro was found guilty of aggravated homicide, asphyxiation, femicide, and concealment of a corpse. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Outside the courtroom, Cecilia's mother, Milu, stood wearing a white t-shirt with a photo of her daughter on the front. She spoke to reporters, her voice filled with both grief and relief. She called Mario a monster, a man who belonged in jail. Finally, after 5 long years, there was justice. Cecilia's brother, Joao, expressed gratitude to the detectives who had never given up. Detective Sergeant Hannah Packer and Detective Inspector John Edwards had kept their promise. They had delivered justice to Cecilia's family, even though it required crossing continents, navigating complex legal systems, and years of relentless work. Today, Cecilia Haddad is remembered not as a victim, but as a woman of remarkable strength and determination. She crossed oceans to build a better life. She earned multiple degrees, spoke 3 languages, and built a successful career in a competitive industry. She started her own business. She had dreams, plans, ambitions. Her friends remember her vibrant social life, her warmth, her generosity. They remember how she lit up a room, how she made people feel welcome and valued. They remember a woman who was deeply loved and respected. But Cecilia's story is also a reminder of a darker truth. Domestic violence and intimate partner violence do not discriminate. They happen to people of all backgrounds, all education levels, all socioeconomic statuses. Cecilia was intelligent, successful, surrounded by friends and family, and yet she found herself trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. When someone decides they want to leave a relationship, that should be the end of it. But for some people, like Mario Santoro, the end is unacceptable. They cannot tolerate rejection. They cannot accept that someone else has the right to walk away. And in the most tragic cases, they choose violence. Cecilia tried to leave. She gave Mario an ultimatum. She confided in her parents. She told people she was afraid. But before she could fully extricate herself from the situation, it was too late. Her mother's last conversation with her, hearing Mario banging on the door, screaming, demanding to be let in. That moment haunts everyone who knows this story. If only Cecilia had called the police. If only she had left sooner. If only someone had intervened. But we can't change the past. We can only learn from it. We can honor Cecilia's memory by listening when someone says they're afraid, by taking threats seriously, by offering support to those trying to leave dangerous relationships. Cecilia's life mattered. Her dreams mattered. Her future mattered. And though it was stolen from her, her story continues to resonate. It reminds us to be vigilant, to be compassionate, to never assume that someone's smiling face means everything is okay behind closed doors. The Lane Cove River flows quietly through Sydney, just as it did that Sunday morning in April 2018. The city continues its rhythm, people living their lives, pursuing their dreams, but there is a marker in the hearts of those who knew Cecilia. A reminder that life is fragile and precious. May she rest in peace, far from the pain that marked her final days. May her family find some measure of comfort in knowing that justice, though delayed, was ultimately served. And may her story serve as a light in the darkness for others who find themselves in similar circumstances. A reminder that help is available, that leaving is possible, and that no one deserves to live in fear. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight's story takes us to the small mountain communities of Colorado, where a young woman's life was cut short by someone she thought was a friend. This is the story of Leah Porter, a case of deception, false comfort, and a brother's determination to find the truth. Let the story wash over you. There's no need to remember every detail, just listen and let yourself drift. In the heart of Colorado, nestled among winding mountain roads and wide open skies, sits the tiny community of Cotopaxi. With a population of fewer than 50 people and a century-old general store at its center, this was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. It was here that Leah Porter grew up. Born on December 28, 1994, Leah was a creative child, the kind who loved to dress up in costumes and create elaborate performances for her family. She had an older brother named Max, and from the very beginning, the two shared something special. They weren't just siblings. They were best friends. Max would join Leah in her imaginative skits, the two of them putting on shows in their living room, making their mother laugh. As they grew older, that bond only strengthened. They listened to the same electronic music, hung out with the same group of artistic friends, attended the same parties. Where you found one, you'd usually find the other. They fought as siblings do. But beneath it all was a friendship that ran deep. Lydia was social, outgoing, a bit of a jokester. She loved taking selfies, documenting every moment of her life on social media. In those photos, you can see a young woman full of life, smiling at the camera, excited about what came next. After graduating from Florence High School in 2013, Leah decided to follow in Max's footsteps and study massage therapy at the same college. It seemed like the perfect plan. But when Max graduated and moved on, something shifted. Without her brother there, Leah struggled to adapt to college life alone. She felt unmoored, adrift. It was during this vulnerable time that Leah met Jesse Mine, who was in his late 30s. They began dating, and for a while things seemed good. But Jesse had his own demons. He introduced Leah to heroin, telling her it helped him feel better when things got dark. Leah, trying to find something to hold on to, began using. What started as occasional use gradually became something more. She was young, lost, and addiction took hold quickly. But Leah didn't want to stay in that darkness. With the help of her friend Mallory Nixon, she started attending Narcotics Anonymous meetings. Working to get clean, slowly she began to find her footing again. Things were looking up. The future seemed brighter. Then on June 2nd, 2014, everything fell apart. Jesse told Leah he was moving to Maryland to be with his family and get clean himself. Their relationship was over. Leah was left with nowhere to live, her belongings packed in her car, and a desperate need for help. Leah had spent the night of June 2nd at the Castle Inn in Castle Rock, Colorado, saying goodbye to Jesse. It was emotional. She was hurt, confused about what to do next. The next morning, June 3rd, they checked out. Jesse headed east, Lisa headed north, toward the Denver area, searching for a friend who could take her in. She posted on social media, reaching out to old friends, anyone who might have a couch she could crash on for a while. Among those who responded was Christopher Wade, a 23-year-old former classmate from Cotopaxi. Leah didn't know him well, but they'd gone to the same high school. He seemed friendly, helpful. He told her she could come stay with him in Westminster, a suburb just northwest of Denver, while she figured things out. Weed lived in an apartment complex on Federal Boulevard. That evening, he later told police they went to Boston Market for dinner, then returned to his apartment. According to Weed, Leah received a text message late that night, around 11 p.m., then abruptly left in a white or light-colored truck with someone he didn't know. That was his story. But Leah never made another call. Never sent another text, never posted another selfie. For a young woman who documented everything, the silence was deafening. When Max couldn't reach his sister, he knew immediately something was wrong. They talked every single day. The silence felt like a physical thing, heavy and terrifying. He called and called, the phone ringing into emptiness. He contacted Les's mother, Renee Jackson, who lived in Rockville. Together, they filed a missing person report on June 5th, 2014. Lee's car was found in the parking lot of Wade's apartment building. Inside, all her belongings from college were gone. It was as if she'd simply vanished. Renee Jackson wasn't the type of mother to sit and wait. She began her own investigation, calling the phone company to get Leah's phone records. When she reviewed them, one number appeared again and again, especially on June 3rd. It was Christopher Wade. She'd never heard that name before, but clearly he'd been in close contact with her daughter. When Renee called Wade, he seemed concerned, eager to help. He explained that he was Lee's accountability partner, someone helping her stay clean from drugs. He repeated his story about Leah leaving after receiving a mysterious phone call. He even joined the search efforts, posting pleas on social media asking people to help find Leah. To everyone watching, he seemed like a caring friend desperate to help. But police were starting to have doubts. They questioned Wade and he gave them permission to search his apartment. Officers noticed something odd. His bed had no sheets on it. When they asked why, Wade said he'd removed them after Renee called him, worried that if police found Leah's DNA there, he might be suspected of something. It was a strange explanation, one that raised more questions than it answered. The search of his apartment revealed hastily cleaned blood spots, and one very prominent stain on his mattress. They found women's underwear that didn't belong to him. On his computer, police discovered something disturbing: violent sexual content, child pornography, more than 20 images. Despite these findings, police didn't have enough evidence to charge him with Leah's disappearance. They could only arrest him for the child pornography. Weed was released, though police kept him under surveillance. Days turned into a week. Leah was still missing, her family was frantic, and Wade was free. Max Porter wasn't content to wait for the justice system. He began asking questions, talking to everyone who'd known Weed in school. What he learned was chilling. Former classmates told him about a journal Weed had kept, one where he'd written detailed fantasies about kidnapping women, holding them as sex slaves, raping and murdering them. People had found Weed strange, unsettling. Even back then, Max knew, deep in his bones, that Weed had killed his sister. He just needed proof. Then he learned something useful. Wade was obsessed with tarot cards. He believed in them completely, consulted them for guidance. Max saw an opportunity. He contacted Wade and suggested they meet at a gazebo in a park near Wade's apartment. He told Wade he wanted to do a tarot card reading together, hoping the cards might reveal something about where Louie was. Wade agreed. What Wade didn't know was that Max would bring friends with him, and that he'd secretly record their entire conversation. On June 12th, about a week after Leah disappeared, they met at the park. Police surveillance teams who'd been following Wade watched from a distance. They had no idea what Max was planning. Max pressed the record button on his phone. Then he began asking questions, his voice filled with desperation and pain. "Chris, look at me, right in my eyes. Dude, where is she?" Weed sighed. "I do not know." "You need to tell us right now, dude. I need my sister back, dude. I'm gonna kill myself without my sister." For a while, Wade maintained his innocence. But as the conversation continued, as Max pleaded and the tarot cards were consulted, something shifted. Whether it was guilt, the weight of his secret, or his belief in the mystical power of the cards, Wade began to talk. He told Max a new version of events. According to Wade, when Leah came to his apartment that night, they'd had consensual sex. Afterward, she asked him for money to buy heroin. When he refused, she grabbed a knife from his kitchen and tried to stab him. Wade claimed he defended himself by grabbing her around the throat. He said he only meant to choke her until she went unconscious, to make her muscles relax so he could take the knife away. But she didn't wake up. She died in his arms. So Wade said he panicked. He placed Leah's body on his bed, changed her clothes, then forced her into a duffel bag. He carried her to the dumpster behind his apartment complex and threw her away like garbage. Her belongings went into various dumpsters around the area. When Max heard these words, something inside him broke, and then hardened. He punched Wade in the face. His friend Eric Fay had to pull him back. Then Max and Eric called 911. They forced Wade to get on the phone. In a calm voice, eerily composed, Wade spoke to the dispatcher. "I'd like to confess to a murder," he said. "The case is for the disappearance of Le Porter." Within minutes, police moved in and arrested him. At the police station, with his lawyer present, Wade confessed again. He stuck to his story about self-defense, but he admitted to everything else: cleaning the crime scene, removing his bed sheets, disposing of the body. Police obtained a warrant to search his apartment again, this time with luminol, a chemical that reveals blood. When they sprayed it, the room lit up. Blood traces covered Wade's bedroom and bathroom. Far more blood than you'd expect from a brief struggle. Fitzroy told investigators he'd put Leah's body in the dumpster on the morning of June 4th. But by the time he confessed, the trash had already been collected and taken to the Commerce City landfill. Police launched a massive search effort, scouring the landfill for 40 consecutive days. Teams worked through mountains of garbage in the summer heat, looking for any trace of Leah Porter. They never found her body. What they did find was a pillowcase containing Leah's cell phone, her wallet, her identification card, and some of her clothes. But Leah herself remained missing, somewhere in that vast expanse of waste, or perhaps somewhere else entirely. Prosecutors faced a difficult decision. They had Wade's confessions. They had the physical evidence from his apartment. They had the damning computer files. But they didn't have a body. In American law, it's incredibly difficult to convict someone of murder without remains. There have been successful prosecutions in no-body homicide cases, but they're rare. It takes just one skeptical juror to prevent a conviction. The district attorney, Dave Young, made a strategic choice. He offered Wade a plea deal. If Wade pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and sexual exploitation of a child relating to the pornography on his computer, he would receive a sentence of 48 years in prison. In exchange, Wade would provide information about where he disposed of Leah's body. Wade accepted the deal. He maintained his claim that he'd put her body in the dumpster, though police and prosecutors doubted this was the whole truth. On November 6, 2015, Wade was formally sentenced to 48 years in prison. He would have to serve 75% of that sentence before becoming eligible for parole, meaning he wouldn't be considered for release until 2048. Lim's family was devastated by the plea agreement. They wanted Wade to face trial for first-degree murder. They wanted him to spend life in prison. Renee Jackson spoke at the sentencing hearing, her voice shaking with anger and grief. "The defendant has a very dark past," she said. "My son and I agree that he will do this again. Perhaps to a child. How will any of us live with that? It would be all of our faults if another human being were harmed or murdered because of this plea deal." But the deal was done. Wade was sent to Colorado's Sterling Correctional Facility, later transferred to Limon Correctional Facility, where he remains today as prisoner number 170598. In a later interview with ABC News' 2020 program, Christopher Wade tried to explain why he'd confessed. He claimed the tarot cards had told him to do it, that they'd revealed his guilt would destroy him unless he let it out. He also said that Leah's spirit had appeared to him and asked him not to commit suicide, which he claimed had been his plan. These explanations rang hollow to those who knew the case. Wade had been studying criminal justice at a college near Denver. He'd been in the Army, working as a helicopter mechanic, and was now taking courses in criminology because he wanted to become a police officer. His professor, Robert Wells, told reporters that Wade would have learned in his classes exactly how to clean a crime scene, how to dispose of evidence, how to evade detection. His efforts to clean and purge the crime scene, Wells explained. "Those are things he could have learned right there in my class." The irony was bitter. Wade had nearly gotten away with murder using the very techniques he'd been taught to prevent. If not for the tarot card meeting, if not for his obsession with mysticism and his need to unburden himself, he might never have been caught. Police believe Wade's story about self-defense is false. Talib was a petite woman, weighing only 98 pounds. Wade was a trained soldier who practiced jiu-jitsu. The amount of blood found in his apartment suggested something far more violent than a struggle over a knife. And there were questions that Wade could never adequately answer. Why didn't he call 911? Why didn't he just run away? Why didn't he try to restrain her instead of killing her? The most likely scenario investigators believe is that Wade made sexual advances toward Leah, and when she resisted, he attacked her. The knife story was invented to justify what he'd done. For Renee Jackson, there has been no closure. Her daughter's body is still missing. For more than a decade now, she has searched the dusty mountain trails of central Colorado, hiking through wilderness areas, consulting psychics, coordinating volunteer search teams. She has memorized every page of the police reports. She has paid for travel expenses for volunteers willing to help look for Leah. "I just can't accept the fact that I don't know where my daughter is," Renee told reporters. "I can't live with that." She believes, in her heart, that we didn't put Leah in the dumpster. She suspects he hid her somewhere he could visit, somewhere meaningful to him. But without more information, without Weed telling the truth, Leah remains lost. A Facebook page, Help Find Leah Porter, continues to this day, sharing updates, organizing searches, keeping Leah's memory alive. On what would have been her birthdays, on the anniversary of her disappearance, her family posts tributes. They share photos of Leah smiling, full of life, the way they want to remember her. Max Porter has had to live with the weight of what he did, confronting his sister's killer, hearing the confession that confirmed his worst fears. He carries the recording of that conversation, a permanent reminder of the moment everything changed. Some might call what he did dangerous, reckless even, but others see it differently. He's a brother who loved his sister so much that he couldn't wait for justice to take its slow course. He took action, and because of him, White is in prison. The case of Leah Porter leaves us with uncomfortable questions. How does someone study criminal justice with the intention of becoming a police officer while harboring violent fantasies? How does a young woman seeking help from an old classmate end up dead? How do we reconcile the smiling photos of Wade in his army uniform, involved in choir and drama in high school, with the man who killed a 98-pound woman and disposed of her body? There are those who wonder if White had done this before, if there were other victims who'd crossed his path and disappeared. The journal about kidnapping and raping women, mentioned by former classmates, suggests he'd been thinking about violence for years. The child pornography on his computer suggests an attraction to the vulnerable, the powerless. But these are questions without answers. Wade is given multiple versions of events, each one self-serving, each one designed to minimize his culpability. The truth died with Larry in that apartment. and Wade has proven himself to be an unreliable narrator of his own story. What we do know is this. On June 3rd, 2014, a 19-year-old woman went to someone she thought was a friend, seeking help during a vulnerable moment. That friend betrayed her trust in the most absolute way possible. He took her life, disposed of her body, and then tried to cover it all up using the very skills he'd learned in his criminal justice classes. If not for tarot cards, if not for a brother's determination, Christopher Wade might have walked free. The story of Leah Porter reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself. It can wear a friendly face, offer help, pretend to care. It can be someone you went to high school with, someone who seems normal on the surface. The danger isn't always obvious, but this story also reminds us of the power of love, of the lengths people will go to for those they care about. Max Porter risked everything to get justice for his sister. Renee Jackson continues to search, refusing to give up hope of bringing Leah home. Somewhere in Colorado, Leah Porter rests. Her family continues to look for her, to keep her memory alive, to fight for the closure they deserve. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Leah. Remember the young woman who loved selfies and electronic music, who performed skits with her brother, who was working to overcome addiction and build a better life. Remember that every missing person case represents not just a statistic, but a whole world of people who love them and are left behind to search. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're going to explore a story that reminds us how darkness can sometimes hide in the most unexpected places. This is the story of Shad Thurian, a young man from Green Bay, Wisconsin, whose life was cut tragically short in February of 2022. As always, we approach these stories with respect for those involved, remembering that behind every case are real people, real families, and real lives forever changed. So take a deep breath, let your mind focus gently on the narrative, and allow yourself to drift as we unfold this story together. Green Bay, Wisconsin. A city known for its football legacy, its place along the Fox River, and its close-knit communities. In this city, on September 7th, 1997, a boy named Shad Rock Thurian was born to Tara Pakanich and Michael Thurian. Shad grew up in the Howard Suamico area, attending local schools where he was known as a kind and compassionate young man. Those who knew him best would tell you that Shad had a way of thinking about others before himself. He was the type of person who would lend a hand without being asked, who would listen when someone needed to talk. As a young man, Shad developed several passions. He loved the outdoors, finding peace in camping trips under Wisconsin's starlit skies. He enjoyed games, spending time with family and friends, creating memories that would later bring both comfort and pain to those who loved him. But perhaps his greatest talent was in his hands. Shad was an artist, particularly skilled in woodworking and wood carving. He could take a simple piece of wood and transform it into something beautiful, something meaningful. After completing his education at Bayport High School, Shad began working alongside his father Michael and his grandfather at their family business. It was honest work, the kind that connects generations, passing down not just skills but values, traditions and bonds that money cannot buy. Shad had siblings who adored him. His sisters Ava and Sylvia, and his brother Bo, all shared in the quiet love of a family that seemed, from the outside, perfectly ordinary. His grandparents, Becky and Steve Fisher, David Pakanich, and Elaine Willicat, doted on him as grandparents do, proud of the man he was becoming. By 2022, Shad was 24 years old. He was still living with his mother, Tara, and her boyfriend, Steve Hendricks, in a modest home on Stony Brook Lane in Green Bay. Like many young adults, he was navigating the complexities of life, working, spending time with friends, and simply existing in the everyday rhythm that we all take for granted. But Shad's life had intersected with someone else's. Someone whose own story was marked by trauma, mental illness, and a dangerous relationship with drugs. That person was Taylor Shad Business. Taylor Denise Coronado was born on November 23rd, 1997, just 2 months after Shad. Her childhood began like many others, but it would be marked by loss and instability that would shape her in profound ways. When Taylor was just 11 years old, her mother Marla died. The cause was cirrhosis of the liver, the result of years of alcohol abuse. For a young girl entering adolescence, losing her mother was devastating. The world she knew suddenly shifted, leaving her feeling unmoored and alone. After her mother's death, Taylor moved to Cotulla, Texas, to live with her paternal grandparents. But the stability she needed never quite materialized. Her father, Arturo Coronado, remarried a woman who had 3 children of her own. According to family accounts, the blended family struggled. Taylor felt like she had lost not just her mother, but her father too, as his attention turned to his new family. Taylor and her brother ended up living in a basement, where once she had a comfortable home, now she found herself pushed to the margins, quite literally underground. The psychological impact of this displacement cannot be overstated. A child who loses a parent and then feels replaced is a child carrying wounds that may never fully heal. By 7th grade, Taylor was already receiving mental health treatment. She struggled with attention and concentration problems, behavioral issues at school. She was prescribed medications for what doctors initially thought might be ADD or ADHD. As time went on, the diagnoses grew more complex. Severe depression, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder. She was given mood stabilizers, antidepressants, antipsychotics. At 18, Taylor made the decision to stop taking her medications. This is not uncommon among young adults who feel that the medications numb them or change who they are. But for someone with Taylor's mental health challenges, going unmedicated would prove to be a dangerous choice. Around this time, Taylor also began experimenting with drugs. She started smoking marijuana at 14. Then came harder substances, cocaine, methamphetamine, crack. By the time she was in her 20s, she was using methamphetamine almost daily, a habit that would last for years. In 2018, Taylor changed her last name from Coronado to Shad Business, after marrying a man named Warren Chabot. The couple had a son together, born in 2021. But Warren himself was no stranger to trouble. By the time of the events we're discussing, he was incarcerated in federal prison on unrelated charges. Their son was being raised by his paternal grandparents in Texas. Taylor's adult life was punctuated by brushes with the law. She had charges for battery, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, bail jumping, and theft on her record. In January of 2022, just weeks before Shad's murder, she was convicted and sentenced to 3 months for fleeing, eluding, and obstructing police. She had even removed a GPS tracker from her ankle at some point. In April and May of 2021, Taylor had been hospitalized following a suicide attempt. It was during this hospitalization that doctors formally diagnosed her with PTSD and bipolar disorder, adding to her already extensive list of mental health conditions. But perhaps most troublingly, Taylor had developed what some might call an obsession with Jeffrey Dahmer, the notorious Milwaukee serial killer, who had murdered 17 young men and boys between 1978 and 1991. In the weeks leading up to Shad's death, Taylor would make numerous internet searches about Dahmer. She searched for phrases like Jeffrey Dahmer walking into court all sexy, and Jeffrey Dahmer's butt. She would later tell a forensic psychologist that she had a thing with Jeffrey Dahmer a year ago, despite the fact that Dahmer had been murdered by a fellow inmate in 1994. Years before Taylor was even born. This was the woman whose path crossed with Shad Thurian's, 2 young people born the same year, growing up in the same general area, but walking very different roads. And in February of 2022, those roads would converge in the most horrific way imaginable. The evening of February 21st, 2022, began like many others for Shad. Around 9:30 p.m., Taylor Shad Business arrived at his mother's house to pick him up. Shad's mother, Tara, and her boyfriend, Steve, were preparing to leave for the evening. Before they left, Tara heard Taylor's voice in the home. It was an ordinary moment, the kind that would later haunt her with its normalcy. Taylor, Shad, and a mutual friend drove to an apartment on Eastman Avenue in Green Bay. There, the 3 of them smoked cannabis together. But after the friend left, Taylor and Shad's evening took a darker turn. According to Taylor's later confession, they both smoked methamphetamine. They also injected themselves with trazodone, an antidepressant that when misused can have sedative and dissociative effects. With chemicals coursing through their systems, Taylor and Shad made the decision to return to Tara's house on Stony Brook Lane. Tara and Steve were gone, The house was empty, quiet, waiting. Shad and Taylor made their way down to the basement. This was a space Shad knew well. His territory, his sanctuary. They began engaging in sexual activity. According to Taylor's account, they had engaged in erotic asphyxiation before. On this particular night, they used metal chains as part of their sexual encounter. But something went wrong. Or perhaps, more accurately, something went terribly right in Taylor's disturbed mind. As Taylor strangled Shad with the chain, he began coughing up blood. In that moment, any reasonable person would have stopped, horrified by what they were doing. But Taylor didn't stop. She later told investigators that it took approximately 3 to 5 minutes for Shad to die. 3 to 5 minutes of sustained strangulation, even as his body fought desperately for air, even as blood came from his mouth. When investigators later asked her about this, Taylor made a chilling statement. She said she had wanted to see what would happen, and when asked directly if she liked it, she responded quietly, "Yeah, I liked it." What happened next is almost too disturbing to comprehend. After Shad died, Taylor engaged in sexual acts with his corpse. She performed oral sex on him. She used sex toys on his body. This went on for several hours. The basement of Tara's home had become a chamber of horrors, though no one above ground had any idea what was transpiring below. As morning approached on February 22nd, Taylor wasn't finished. She went to the kitchen and found knives. She tried several experimenting until she found that a serrated bread knife worked best for what she intended to do. Taylor positioned Shad's body on the bed. She placed a bucket and a storage tote beneath him to catch the blood, and then methodically she began to decapitate him. She cut off his head and let the blood drain into the containers below. When the bucket and tote were full of blood, she carried them to the basement shower and poured the blood down the drain. But Taylor wasn't finished dismembering Shad's body. She continued cutting. She removed his organs. She separated his limbs. She placed pieces of him into plastic bags, into the storage tote, into cardboard boxes. His genitals went into the bucket with his head. She worked for hours, carving apart the young man who had trusted her, who had welcomed her into his mother's home. Taylor later told police that she had intended to take all of Shad's remains with her. She loaded some of the body parts into her Gold Town and Country minivan, but at some point she said she got paranoid and lazy. She thought it was the dope making her paranoid, so she left some of the body parts behind in the basement. She put a towel over the bucket containing Shad's head and genitals and left it at the bottom of the basement stairs. In the early morning hours of February 23rd, Taylor left the house on Stony Brook Lane. The door slammed shut behind her, loud enough to wake Tara, who was back home and asleep upstairs. Tara Pekanich woke to the sound of the door slamming. It was sometime between 2:30 and 3 in the morning. She heard a vehicle driving away, the minivan that had been parked outside. Tara got out of bed and noticed that a light was still on in the basement. She called out for Shad, but received no response. Thinking perhaps he had left with Taylor, as he had done before, Tara began to walk down the basement stairs. She looked around the familiar space, expecting to see it empty, but then her eyes fell on something that didn't belong there. At the bottom of the stairs sat a 5-gallon bucket. A towel had been placed over the top of it. Tara approached the bucket. She lifted the towel. Inside was her son's severed head. The scream that followed brought Steve running. At 3:25 a.m., Steve made the call to 911. His voice on the recording is tight with panic and disbelief. "She found the severed head of her son in the basement," he told the dispatcher. "There's something in the goddamn bucket." Green Bay police officers were dispatched immediately to 829 Stony Brook Lane. When Officer Alex Wanish arrived and descended into the basement, he found a scene that would haunt even the most experienced investigators. Shad's head was in the bucket, just as Tara had described. But it wasn't just the head. Also in the bucket were his genitals, body fluids, and 2 knives. The tools Taylor had used to dismember him. As officers searched the rest of the basement, they found more. Body parts had been placed in plastic bags, scattered around the space. Organs were in cardboard boxes. Blood had soaked into the mattress on Shad's bed. The scene was one of absolute carnage, made all the more disturbing by the methodical way it had been arranged. One of the responding officers, a young rookie, would later be deeply traumatized by what he witnessed that morning. Even veteran detectives, men and women who had seen decades of crime scenes, would describe this as one of the worst they had ever encountered. While investigators were processing the nightmare in the basement of Stony Brook Lane, they were also working to locate Taylor Shaw Business. It didn't take long. Later that same day, on February 23rd, police found Taylor at an apartment complex on Eastman Avenue, the same complex where she and Shad had smoked methamphetamine the night before. She was leaving an apartment building when she spotted investigators. She stopped in her tracks. An officer asked her if she knew why they were there. Taylor responded calmly, "Because of my warrant for my arrest." She was referring to an outstanding warrant. Seemingly unaware, or perhaps pretending to be unaware, that police had connected her to something far more serious. Detectives immediately noticed that Taylor's clothing was covered in dried blood. Her gray sweatshirt had blood on the front. Her sweatpants had blood on them. Her hands were smeared with what appeared to be blood, and she had a cut on her left thumb. There were scratches on her arms, which she would later claim were self-inflicted. Taylor was taken to the Green Bay Police Department for questioning. Before the interview began, investigators read her Miranda rights. She indicated that she understood them and agreed to speak with detectives. The interview that followed would provide investigators with a confession so disturbing, so detailed, and so lacking in remorse that even seasoned detectives would struggle to maintain their composure. Detective Kevin Kempf and Detective David Graff led the questioning. They asked Taylor what had happened at the house on Stony Brook Lane, and Taylor, speaking in a matter-of-fact tone that seemed disconnected from the horror of her words, told them everything. She described strangling Shad with the chain. She described how he had coughed up blood, but she kept going, kept choking him. "I wanted to see what happens," she said. When asked if she liked it, she responded affirmatively. She described the hours she spent with Shad's corpse, engaging in sexual acts. She described finding the knives in the kitchen, testing them, determining that the bread knife with its serrated blade worked best. She described cutting off Shad's head, removing his organs, dismembering his body piece by piece. At one point during the interview, Taylor made a comment that would chill everyone who heard it. She asked the detectives, in a lower tone of voice, "Do you know what it's like to love something so much that you kill it?" When asked about the bucket, Taylor explained that she had intended to take all of Shad's body parts with her, but had gotten lazy. She forgot the bucket at the bottom of the stairs. It was an oversight, a detail left unfinished, like forgetting to take out the trash. Taylor also told investigators that she had placed other body parts in her minivan, intending to dispose of them later. Officers searched the vehicle and found Shad's legs in a crock-pot box behind the driver's seat. Throughout the interview, Taylor's affect was flat, detached. She showed little emotion. No tears, no obvious remorse. She spoke about dismembering a human being the way someone might describe rearranging furniture as a task that required effort, but held no emotional weight. On March 1st, 2022, Taylor Shea Business was formally charged with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, and third-degree sexual assault. Her bond was set at $2 million cash. The case against Taylor Shea Business was straightforward in terms of evidence. She had confessed. Her DNA was at the scene. Shad's blood was on her clothing. Body parts were in her vehicle. But the legal proceedings that followed would be anything but simple. Almost immediately, questions arose about Taylor's mental competency. Was she mentally fit to stand trial? Did she understand the charges against her? Could she assist in her own defense? In April of 2022, a court-ordered psychological evaluation was conducted. The evaluator, Dr. Colleen Collins, determined that Taylor was competent to proceed with trial, but Taylor's defense attorney, Quinn Jolly, was not satisfied with this finding. He pointed to Taylor's extensive mental health history. The diagnoses of bipolar disorder, PTSD, severe depression, ADHD, borderline personality disorder. He noted that she had been hospitalized multiple times for psychiatric issues, including a suicide attempt. He requested a second evaluation. Judge Thomas Walsh, who was presiding over the case, granted the request. A second psychological evaluation would be conducted. The results of this second evaluation, reviewed in May, also found Taylor competent to stand trial, but the competency issue would come up again and again throughout the pretrial proceedings. Each time, Judge Walsh would rule that Taylor was competent to proceed. On September 1st, 2022, Attorney Jolly entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity on Taylor's behalf. This plea meant that Taylor was not disputing that she had killed and dismembered Shad Therion. Instead, she was arguing that she had been legally insane at the time, unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions or conform her behavior to the requirements of the law. Throughout the pretrial period, Taylor remained in custody at the Brown County Jail, held on that $2 million bond. And then in February of 2023, something happened that would shock everyone following the case, and demonstrate just how volatile Taylor's shop business could be. On February 14th, 2023, Valentine's Day, ironically, Taylor appeared in court for a hearing. Her attorney, Quinn Jolly, had filed a motion requesting that the trial date be pushed back. He wanted more time for experts to evaluate Taylor's competency and her mental state at the time of the crime. Judge Walsh indicated that he was inclined to grant the request. He suggested moving the trial date from March to May to allow for the additional evaluation. What happened next was captured on courtroom cameras and would become one of the most shocking moments in Wisconsin courtroom history. Taylor, sitting next to her attorney, suddenly lunged at Quinn Jolly. She struck him in the head with her elbow. As bailiffs rushed to intervene, she continued to attack him, hitting him multiple times before deputies could wrestle her to the ground and restrain her. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Judge Walsh called for order. Deputies struggled with Taylor, who fought against them even as they attempted to place her in restraints. After she was finally subdued and removed from the courtroom, a deputy could be heard on the recording saying, "You went off on your attorney, Taylor. You went crazy on your attorney." Quinn Jolly, who had been advocating for his client, who had been working to get her the mental health evaluation she needed, had been attacked by the very person he was trying to help. Understandably, Jolly filed a motion to be removed from the case. Judge Walsh granted it. A new attorney, Christopher Froelich, was appointed to represent Taylor, and Judge Walsh, who had witnessed the attack firsthand, was asked to recuse himself from the case since he could now be called as a witness to Taylor's behavior. Walsh declined to recuse himself, a decision that would stand throughout the remainder of the proceedings. The incident raised even more questions about Taylor's mental state, but it also demonstrated something else, that she was capable of purposeful, directed violence, that she could identify a target and attack, that there was, beneath whatever mental illness she suffered from, an element of control and choice. The trial was rescheduled, and as the months passed, the small city of Green Bay waited to see what would happen when the case finally went before a jury. On July 24th, 2023, nearly 17 months after Shad Therion's murder, jury selection began for the trial of Taylor Shad Business. 16 jurors were selected, 12 to deliberate and 4 alternates. The jury consisted of 9 women and 7 men. The trial would be conducted in 2 phases. First, the jury would determine whether Taylor had committed the crime she was charged with. First-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, and third-degree sexual assault. Then, if she was found guilty, a second phase would determine whether Taylor had been legally insane at the time of the crimes, whether she had suffered from a mental disease or defect that prevented her from appreciating the wrongfulness of her actions. Assistant District Attorney Caleb Saunders delivered the opening statement for the prosecution. His message was clear and direct. The state would prove that Taylor Shad Business had intentionally killed Shad Therion. This was not an accident. This was not a momentary lapse. It's not one pull of a gun trigger, Saunders told the jury. It's an intense act. Defense attorney Christopher Froelich, in his opening statement, reminded the jury that there are 2 sides to every story. He asked them to keep an open mind, to pay attention to all of the evidence before reaching a decision. Over the next 3 days, the jury would hear testimony that was, at times, almost unbearable to listen to. Tara Pakanich, Shad's mother, took the stand. In a voice barely above a whisper, she described the morning of February 23rd. She described hearing the door slam, going downstairs, seeing the bucket, lifting the towel. She described the moment her world shattered. The moment she looked into that bucket and saw her son's severed head staring back at her. There was not a dry eye in the courtroom as Tara testified. Even the judge had to pause and collect himself. This was not just evidence. This was a mother's nightmare made real. Steve Hendricks, Tara's boyfriend, testified about making the 911 call. He described the shock, the disbelief, the terrible understanding that something unspeakable had happened in their home. Officer Alex Wanish described arriving at the scene, descending into the basement, and discovering the horror that awaited him there. His testimony was clinical, factual. but the strain in his voice betrayed the emotional toll the scene had taken on him. The jury was shown body camera footage from the responding officers. They saw the bucket. They saw the blood-soaked mattress. They saw the plastic bags containing body parts. Some jurors looked away. Others stared, faces pale, trying to comprehend the enormity of what had been done to Shad Thurian. Dr. Vincent Trenchita, a deputy medical examiner from Dane County, provided expert testimony about Shad's autopsy. His words were measured, scientific, but the picture they painted was horrifying. This body was essentially bloodless. Dr. Trenchita explained. The killer had systematically drained Shad's blood, first by decapitating him over the bucket and tote, then by pouring the collected blood down the drain. Dr. Trenchita described how the body had been bisected, cut in half, how the back had been flayed and defleshed, with skin and muscles removed to expose the ribcage and spine, how organs had been extracted, how limbs had been separated. The process of doing this, Dr. Trenchita testified, would have taken hours. It was not quick. It was not easy. It was deliberate, methodical butchery. Dr. Trenchita also testified about the toxicology results. Shad had cocaine, methamphetamine, marijuana in his system at the time of his death. But these drugs, the medical examiner explained, were not the cause of death. The cause of death was strangulation. The manner of death was homicide. Then came perhaps the most damning evidence of all, Taylor's own words. Detectives Kevin Kemp and David Graff testified about their interview with Taylor after her arrest. The jury was shown more than an hour of video from that interview. It watched as Taylor, sitting calmly across from investigators, described in detail what she had done to Shad. They heard her describe strangling him, watching him cough up blood, continuing anyway because she wanted to see what happens. They heard her admit that she liked it. They heard her describe performing sexual acts on Shad's corpse. They heard her describe the dismemberment, the way the bread knife worked best, the careful process of draining his blood. At one point in the video, Taylor said something that would echo in the minds of everyone who heard it. Speaking about the act of strangling Shad, she said, "I was riding him like a donkey, okay, I think so. And I think that's what was happening, and I started pulling, and I don't know. And then I just didn't stop. I don't know why I just didn't stop. I didn't stop." The jury also heard that Taylor had told investigators she initially intended to take all of Shad's body parts with her, but had gotten lazy. She forgot the bucket, she forgot pieces of him in the basement. This was not remorse speaking. This was annoyance at her own forgetfulness. The prosecution also presented evidence of Taylor's internet search history. In the week before Shad's murder, Taylor had made numerous searches related to Jeffrey Dahmer. She had looked up images of Dahmer in court, searched for information about him, seemed fascinated by the serial killer who had murdered and dismembered 17 young men. Judge Walsh had ruled that these searches could be admitted as evidence, as they demonstrated Taylor's state of mind leading up to the crime. The defense had objected, arguing that the searches were prejudicial, but the objection was overruled. Throughout the trial, Taylor sat at the defense table, sometimes showing emotion, sometimes appearing detached. At times she was seen smirking as gruesome testimony was presented. Observers in the courtroom and those watching via live stream were disturbed by her demeanor. She seemed in many moments not to fully grasp the severity of what she had done, or perhaps she simply didn't care. On July 26, 2023, after 3 days of testimony, the case went to the jury for deliberation on the first phase, guilt or innocence on the charges. The jury deliberated for approximately 30 minutes. 30 minutes. They returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. First-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, third-degree sexual assault. But the trial was not over. Now came the second phase, the part where the jury would determine whether Taylor had been legally insane at the time of the crimes. The second phase of the trial focused on a single question. At the time Taylor Shab Business killed and dismembered Shad Thurian, did she suffer from a mental disease or defect that prevented her from appreciating the wrongfulness of her actions, or conforming her conduct to the requirements of the law? This was the heart of Taylor's defense. Her attorney, Christopher Froelich, argued that Taylor suffered from severe bipolar disorder, that she had been in a psychotic state at the time of the murder, that the combination of her untreated mental illness and the massive amounts of methamphetamine she had consumed had rendered her unable to control her actions or understand that what she was doing was wrong. The defense called several witnesses to support this theory. Taylor's father, Arturo Coronado, testified on his daughter's behalf. It was a strange moment. Coronado himself was in custody, appearing in court, wearing an orange jail jumpsuit and shackles, as he was serving time for a child rape conviction. But despite his own serious crimes, he spoke about his concern for his daughter. Coronado testified that Taylor had experienced hallucinations, that he had sought help for her multiple times because she wasn't in her right mind. He said he had always been worried about her mental health, going back to when she was young. The defense also called Dr. Diane Litton, a forensic psychologist, as an expert witness. Dr. Litton had evaluated Taylor and reviewed her medical records extensively. She testified that in her professional opinion, Taylor suffered from undiagnosed bipolar disorder, and that at the time of Shad's murder, Taylor had been in a psychotic state. Based on my experience and training, that's a psychotic person right there, Dr. Litton told the jury. She described Taylor's behavior as really weird, bizarre, and off the scale. She testified that in her 32 years of experience, she had seen many psychotic, bipolar, manic patients, but few like Taylor. Dr. Litton argued that Taylor's long history of mental health problems going back to 7th grade demonstrated a pattern of mental illness that predated her drug use. Yes, drugs had exacerbated her condition, but the underlying disorder was there regardless. The defense also called Dr. James O'Donnell, a pharmacist, to testify about the effects of methamphetamine on someone with Taylor's mental health conditions. Dr. O'Donnell explained that Taylor had told him she had taken what she described as 51 hits of methamphetamine in the hours before the murder. "I've never heard of that much methamphetamine use," Dr. O'Donnell testified. He explained that methamphetamine exacerbates bipolar disorder, affecting brain chemistry, cognition, thinking, control of behavior, risk-taking, and memory. In his opinion, the massive amount of meth Taylor had consumed, combined with her untreated mental illness, had likely triggered a drug-induced psychosis. The defense argued that while Taylor's actions were horrific, they were the product of a severely mentally ill woman in the grip of psychosis, not the deliberate choices of someone who understood right from wrong. But the prosecution had a very different narrative to present. The state called its own expert witnesses, including Dr. Matthew Seipel, a court-appointed psychologist. Dr. Seipel testified that he had concerns about Taylor's bipolar diagnosis. He noted that for someone to be properly diagnosed with bipolar disorder, the symptoms cannot occur exclusively during substance intoxication. In other words, if the symptoms only appear when someone is high on drugs, it's not bipolar disorder, it's drug-induced. Dr. Seipel also noted that there were no reliable records showing Taylor had been in psychiatric treatment in February of 2022, right before the murder. There was no corroboration of her claims about her mental state at that time. Most importantly, Dr. Seipel and other prosecution experts pointed to Taylor's behavior after the murder as evidence that she knew what she had done was wrong. She had attempted to clean up the crime scene, at least partially. She had tried to take body parts with her to dispose of them elsewhere. She had hidden Shad's head under a towel in the bucket. These were not the actions of someone who didn't understand the wrongfulness of her conduct. These were the actions of someone trying to avoid getting caught. The prosecution argued that Taylor's confession, given just hours after the murder, was coherent and detailed. She remembered what she had done. She could explain her actions. She could walk investigators through the sequence of events. This was not the rambling, disjointed testimony of someone in the grip of psychosis. This was someone who knew exactly what she had done. Detective David Graff testified that in his interview with Taylor, she had initially said the killing was not intentional. But as the interview continued, her story changed. She admitted that once she started strangling Shad, she found that she enjoyed it. So she kept going. Initially, some of her comments were that it hadn't been intended, Detective Graff told the jury. But once she started to strangle Shad, she found that she did enjoy it, and so she kept on strangling him. That admission, the prosecution argued, demonstrated clear intent. Taylor made a choice to continue strangling Shad, even after she saw him coughing up blood. She made a choice to watch him die because she enjoyed it. The jury also heard that when officers arrested Taylor, she had asked if they knew about her outstanding warrants. She hadn't said, "I don't know what happened," or "I blacked out," or "I can't remember." She had asked about a warrant. This suggested she was in touch with reality, that she understood she was in trouble with the law. After a single day of testimony in the sanity phase, the case went back to the jury. Once again, the jury deliberated quickly. They returned with their verdict. Taylor Shade Business did not suffer from a mental disease or defect at the time she killed Shade Thurian. She was criminally responsible for her actions. The verdict meant that Taylor would be sentenced to prison, not to a secure mental health facility. It meant the law viewed her as someone who had made choices, horrific choices, but choices nonetheless. On September 26, 2023, Taylor Schabusiness appeared in Brown County Circuit Court for sentencing. She wore a spit guard, a mesh covering over her face. The Brown County Sheriff's Office explained that Taylor had been spitting on people in the jail, and the guard was necessary to protect those around her in the courtroom. It was a fitting image for who Taylor had become. Someone so disconnected from normal human behavior, so willing to assault and degrade others, that even basic courtroom proceedings required special precautions. Before Judge Thomas Walsh pronounced sentence, members of Shad's family were given the opportunity to address the court. Tara Pakanich, Shad's mother, stood before the court. Her victim impact statement was a testament to a mother's unending grief. She described the pain of losing her son, not just to death, but to such unthinkable violence. She described the horror of discovering his severed head in her own home. She described how that image would never leave her mind, how it haunted her every day. Shad's father, Michael Therion, also spoke. His words conveyed the loss of a son he had worked alongside, a son he had hoped would carry on family traditions. He spoke about the hole in their lives that could never be filled. Then it was time for Judge Walsh to deliver the sentence. For the first-degree intentional homicide conviction, Taylor was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Wisconsin does not have the death penalty, so this was the harshest sentence possible under state law. It meant Taylor would die in prison, but Judge Walsh wasn't finished. For the mutilation of a corpse conviction, he added another 2 years consecutive to the life sentence. For the third-degree sexual assault conviction, he added another 3 years consecutive. The message was clear. Even though the life sentence meant Taylor would never be released, Judge Walsh wanted there to be consequences for every single crime she had committed against Shad Therion. Taylor's total sentence was life in prison plus 5 years, all without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Taylor showed little reaction. The woman who had strangled a young man, who had spent hours dismembering his body, who had spoken about loving something so much you kill it, stood emotionless before the court. She was remanded to the custody of the Wisconsin Department of Corrections. She would be transferred to Taycheedah Correctional Institution, a maximum security women's prison in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. There, she would spend the rest of her natural life. The murder of Shad Therion sent shockwaves through the Green Bay community. This was not a random act of violence between strangers. This was something that happened in someone's home, in a basement where a young man should have been safe. The case raised uncomfortable questions about drug use, mental health, and how someone can slip through the cracks of the system so completely that they end up committing unthinkable acts. Taylor Schabusiness had been diagnosed with multiple mental health conditions going back to her early teens. She had been hospitalized for a suicide attempt. She had a history of criminal behavior. She had stopped taking her medications years before the murder, and yet there had been no intervention significant enough to change the trajectory of her life. Similarly, Shad Therion had been using drugs the night of his death. Methamphetamine is a poison that destroys lives, families, and communities. While Taylor alone was responsible for her actions, the drugs both she and Shad had consumed that night created a dangerous situation that might otherwise never have occurred. The case also highlighted the dangers of erotic asphyxiation, a sexual practice that involves restricting oxygen to the brain. According to the FBI, between 250 and 1,000 deaths occur each year in the United States due to autoerotic asphyxiation. When practiced with a partner, the risks multiply. What starts as consensual can turn deadly in seconds, and the line between accident and intentional killing can be difficult to determine. For Shad's family, the pain will never end. Tara Pekanix lost her son in the most traumatic way imaginable. She discovered his remains in her own home. That kind of trauma doesn't heal. It just becomes something you learn to carry. Shad's siblings lost their brother. His father lost his son and co-worker. His grandparents lost a beloved grandson. An entire community lost a young man, who by all accounts was kind, talented, and had his whole life ahead of him. Shad never got to see his 25th birthday. He never got to continue his woodworking and pursue his artistic passions. He never got to build the life he deserved. All of that potential was snuffed out in a basement on a cold February night by someone he thought he could trust. The case against Taylor Shub Business was one of the most disturbing in Wisconsin history. The details of what she did were so horrific that even experienced prosecutors and judges struggled to maintain their composure. The brutality was not impulsive, it was methodical, sustained, and deliberate. And yet Taylor's story is also a cautionary tale about what happens when mental illness goes untreated. When childhood trauma is never processed, when someone loses their way and there's no one to help them find it again. None of this excuses what Taylor did. She made choices. She murdered an innocent man. She mutilated his body. She showed no genuine remorse. But understanding the factors that led to such evil can perhaps help prevent future tragedies. It reminds us of the importance of mental health care, of the devastating effects of drug abuse, of the need for intervention when someone's life begins to spiral. For the people of Green Bay, the case has faded somewhat from the daily headlines. But the memory remains. The house on Stony Brook Lane stands as a silent witness to what happened there. The Green Bay Police Department officers who responded to that scene carry those images with them still. The jurors who had to view the evidence and listen to the testimony will never forget what they saw and heard. And somewhere in Tayarrah Correctional Institution, Taylor Shub Business sits in a cell, serving a sentence that will only end with her death. Whether she feels remorse, whether she understands the magnitude of what she took from the world when she killed Shab Burian, we may never know. What we do know is that on February 23rd, 2022, the world lost a young man who deserved so much better than the fate he received. In the aftermath of the trial, Shad Therian's family worked to ensure that he would be remembered for who he was, not for what was done to him. They shared memories of Shad's kindness, his sense of humor, his talent for woodworking. They talked about his love for camping, for spending time outdoors under the Wisconsin sky. They remembered the way he would help others without being asked, the way he thought of people before himself. An obituary published after his death captured the essence of who Shad had been. It spoke of his compassion, his artistic nature, his love for his family. It mentioned that he was preceded in death by his great-grandparents, and was survived by his parents, his siblings, his grandparents, and countless other family members and friends who loved him. The obituary included a simple but powerful phrase. He enjoyed camping, gaming, and carving. These were the things that had brought Shad joy. These were the things he should have been able to continue doing for decades to come. A visitation was held at Blaney Funeral Home in Green Bay, followed by a funeral service at the First Among Baptist Church. Shad's family and friends gathered to mourn, to support one another, and to say goodbye to a young man taken far too soon. At the service, people shared stories. They talked about the Shad they knew, the real person behind the headlines, behind the crime scene photos, behind the nightmare that his final hours had become. They celebrated his life, even as they grieved his death. Shad was laid to rest at Nicolay Memorial Gardens in Green Bay. His grave is marked with a headstone that bears his name. His dates September 7th, 1997 to February 23rd, 2022. And one imagines the love of everyone who knew him. For those who loved Shad, the trial provided some measure of justice. Taylor Shad Business would spend the rest of her life in prison. She would never hurt anyone else. But justice, even when served, cannot bring Shad back. It cannot erase what happened. It cannot give his family the life they should have had with him. Still in it. And so they move forward, day by day, carrying their grief and their memories, trying to honor Shad's life by living their own, by loving one another, by holding tight to the people who matter, because that's what Shad would have wanted. He was the kind of person who cared about others, who wanted the people around him to be happy and safe. His legacy is not the violence that ended his life. His legacy is the love he gave while he lived. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.